Hey folks, welcome back to History Chat on October 8th. And I want you to know that there are 2 days in the year I do whatever the heck I want. One is Christmas and one is October 8th. So I am winging this and I'm doing whatever the hell I want. So if you're not interested in sort of a freewheeling trip today through some major concepts, it's a good day not to come. That being said, I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do with this slot in normal times. I'm thinking to turn this into something between me and perhaps one other person until the election. You probably know who I have in mind. But I haven't gotten there yet. And today I'm just going to go for a quick trip through some major concepts in American history, including, of course, democracy, socialism, fascism, and where we are today. So that's not much for an hour. So like I say, I'm just going to have fun today. And I wanted to start today, first of all, again, by doing the usual introduction, by saying my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a history professor, but I do not, believe me, speak for my employer when I do these talks, especially today. I'm laughing because I suspect discussing fascism is not necessarily something that would necessarily come up on today's reading lists in colleges. But I'm going to go for it because it's October 8th. All right, so I wanted to start here today, and that's with the tweet from Senator Mike Lee of Utah from 2:24 this morning, saying, and I quote, "Democracy isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are," prosperity is misspelled, of course. "We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that." Okay, that's a big deal. That tweet is a really big deal. I'm really glad I was actually up at 2:24, but I'm really glad I didn't see it because I wouldn't have gone to bed at 3 as I did. So what's going on with that? And what I want to do is talk about how the concepts that he embodied in that tweet have affected American history since the beginning, because you have all heard that incredibly frustrating sentence, "We're not a democracy, we're a republic," which, as I say, is one way to get political historians simply to break out in hives. And that's true. That's true that the founders created a republic, not a democracy. But where is the through line on all this from the founders to the present? And that's what I want to do today, hitting some major concepts along the way. So I just started by saying that the founders did not believe in democracy, or rather that they created a republic. And what did that mean? So first of all, let's start with definitions. Both a democracy and a republic are governments in which the people get to choose their lawmakers, their leaders. And people get upset about the word leader. I do not mean like El Duce. I mean like the people who make our laws, so our lawmakers. So essentially, they are different flavors of the same thing. Technically, a democracy means everybody votes directly for everything that happens. And of course, that's not possible in a country as big as ours. So we are a republic, which means we vote for our representatives, which is why they're called representatives. I don't get to march onto the floor of Congress and start voting. I do get to march to my polling place and vote for somebody to represent me on the floor of Congress when they vote for laws. So the red herring, "we are not a democracy, we're a republic," actually comes from the 1950s. And it is a term that the John Birch Society, which was fervently anti-communist, but also fervently anti-Black rights, used when they tried to stand against the idea that voting rights should be opened up. They said, no, we were never a democracy, we were always a republic. So let's go back to what this meant in the early years of the American Republic. So I said the founders did not set up a democracy, both because of the size of the area they were trying to cover, but also because they were concerned about the idea of people without educations, because you don't really have public education except in New England in the early years. And that's a very specific kind of education. They're worried about people without education and without access to information having a say in society, because it's not at all clear that they will be able to vote intelligently on what matters in society. So the founders do set up a system that is a republic. And I've talked here a lot about the Electoral College and how the Electoral College was initially designed to be a bit of a break between the people on the ground, if you will, ordinary white men who are the ones primarily going to be voting. Little bit of a caveat there. Women do vote in New Jersey, and African Americans do vote in the state of in Maine, which is Massachusetts at the time. I don't know if they could vote in Massachusetts. They do get to vote in Maine, and possibly other places as well. I actually don't know the state laws from that period very well. If you're interested, there's a great website on it. And that itself is a great story. Someday maybe I'll just tell you the stories of great historians. But anyway, so they build in the Electoral College in part to be a break on that population. But the Electoral College itself was initially supposed to be representative. They were supposed to vote by district. So that your vote would essentially be split. If you were in a state that went, say, there wouldn't be that many in those days, 4 people for one leader and 5 people for the other. That's how your state's electoral vote would go. Well, that gets flattened almost instantly after the first real election we have is 1896, because the first 2 elections, it's pretty clear George Washington's won it going away because they basically wrote the position of the executive for him. But in 1896, it's not at all clear who's going to win the 1896 election. And it becomes clear to Thomas Jefferson that he would have won if all of Virginia's electoral votes had gone for him. So he, before the election of 1800, arranges for the electoral votes of Virginia to go entirely as a block, a winner-take-all system. Now, the other founders, people like Madison and Alexander Hamilton, are appalled by this, and they both want amendments to the Constitution to say that you can't do this. And Hamilton goes so far as to write one, but it never actually gets passed, because if you get into office based on the winner-take-all system, you're not eager to change it. But it's the changing from 1800, the electoral system changes to be a winner-take-all system. And when that happens, as that happens, a number of other things happen, including after 1812, the way that we nominate presidents. Because one of the things that happens in 1812 is that until we have real functioning political parties, it's one of the reasons I talk so much about political parties, the only way for a president to get nominated is from the members of his party who sit in Congress. And if you look at the separation of powers, that essentially means that Congress critters, which I say lovingly as I say, can go ahead and they can say to somebody, we'll make you president if you promise to do X. And that's going to mean that the president is dependent on the Congress for power. And people are really nervous about this. And so after this appears to be the case under Madison, that Madison gets nominated in the 1812 election, because the Congress critters who nominate him get him to agree to go to war with England. When that happens, we get the idea of nominating conventions. Now, when you get the idea of popular nominating conventions, you get the need to create a large political party. Now, you can see what I'm doing here with that emphasis on that. You guys figured out today's my birthday. Yes, October 8th is the day I do whatever I want. And so today you're going to hear about the whole sweep of American history. So with that, they figured out that if you're going to have nominating conventions that depend on regular voters, they increase the ability of regular voters to vote. So after 1800, between 1800 and about 1840, but really by the time you get Andrew Jackson running his juggernaut campaign in 1832, you get more and more states opening up the vote more and more and more, and emphasizing the word democracy, emphasizing the idea that we live in a democracy. And that's why people at the time championed Andrew Jackson, because, you know, for all that perhaps people in the present, and I think I am speaking for myself here, look at Andrew Jackson and are appalled with the things he did, not least to the indigenous people of this country and to the spread of slavery and all the things he did. What he really was doing at the time was convincing ordinary Americans that they had a right to have a say in their government and that they had a right to be represented in it. They had a right literally to hold office, as opposed to simply having those founders, the founding fathers from Virginia, Madison and Monroe, and even Adams from Massachusetts, who were all elites. You know, they were all people of great education and money. Jackson is not. Jackson's a man of money, but he's illiterate early on in his years. He never learns to spell. I love the fact he just like, spelling is for weenies. I'm not one of them. But in the 1830s and in the 1840s, we get this emphasis on democracy, on the idea that this government belongs to ordinary Americans. So what's the problem? What is Mike Lee talking about? Well, what happens is that, and actually I want to say quickly, that whole emphasis on democracy is one that I'm spending a lot of time studying right now because it really interests me, not least because after the Jacksonian sort of revolution, if you will, people who supported Jackson and the idea of ordinary participation in government didn't, if they felt like they really had a problem to push that idea because there was no literature on it. You know, remember, the concept of a government that is by ordinary people is brand new in this era. Now we're really used to it, but they're really not used to it at all. It's brand new. So they actively try to create a literature of democracy. And they actively create a new magazine called The Democratic Review, which you can read online now. It's online, which is great. It was not when I was in graduate school. But they start to publish authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who, you know, drove us all nuts with the Scarlet Letter. But what he's really doing is looking at homes, what family homes look. He's doing other stuff as well, but he's kind of looking at the centrality of ordinary homes in the construction of a society. You get Herman Melville writing his books, and if you think about things like Moby Dick, you know, it is literally a picture of a ship of state run by ordinary people whose leader, and I'm going to be delicate here, takes them off course. But that question of the construction of a community. And finally, one of my favorite examples of the writers for the Democratic Review is Walt Whitman. You know, when Walt Whitman writes the poetry, The Leaves of Grass, you know, I sing a song of myself. Not of kings or queens. I sing a song of myself. And then he goes through and he says, I sing of boatmen. I sing of loggers. I sing of, you know, and obviously it's mostly men because the way he saw the world was very much a bromance kind of way. But he is constructing a literature of democracy. Okay. So we're done, right? We can all quit because we've got this great democracy. We also, by the way, have the rise of the Hudson River School of painting, which is the Thomas Coles, for example, and later on you're going to have the Bierstadts, who comes out of the Hudson River School. But those are pictures that are designed to emphasize the land, with the idea that this new democracy comes out of the land. But it's a very interesting democracy because it's a male democracy. And it's almost exclusively a white male democracy. So by the 1850s, when you get pictures by people like George Caleb Bingham, he's looking at the election, you know, the county election, which he paints in 1852, it's all white men. I mean, there's some drunks in the gutter and these little boys and all that, but there ain't no African Americans, and there sure as heck ain't no women. So you have this idea. So what's wrong? What happens? Well, what happens is something crucial for American history, but also for the present moment. And that is, we get after Jackson, we get the spread into the Southeast of large planters. So Jackson talks about how he wants to, you know, help the indigenous people. But basically, he's tossing them out of their ancestral lands into Oklahoma, which at the time is known as Indian Territory, to get that land. And he tells his supporters that he's getting that land for them, you know, for the ordinary guy, so he can rise. But the reality is, and there's a phenomenal book on this by a guy named Josh Rothman, who's my partner in crime over at We're History, that talks about what the land rush looked like after 1830. It's called Flush Times and Fever Dreams. And basically there's this extraordinary land rush into the land that is free now for white settlement and the importation of enslaved people into that Southeast after the forced removal of the indigenous people in that area, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles. Jackson pushes them out, and into that land rush settlers. They rush in to make bank on that very, very rich land by planting cotton in it. But the truth is, with any land rush or with any rush like that, what happens is the little guys get forced out. It's basically about speculation. The little guys get forced out, and the land goes to the people with a lot of capital who also are able to work the land because they enslave large gangs of people. So this concept of democracy and everybody having a say and everybody going ahead and being able to make it in America that is embraced in the 1830s and the 1840s quickly becomes, by the late 1840s and the 1850s, a system in the American South where a very small part of the population, it's less than 1%. It's about 1% of the Southern population. So therefore it's less than 1% of the entire American population, and they have the vast majority of the wealth in the American South, and they are the richest Americans in the country because they do have a monopoly on cotton. And cotton is, as you're going to hear in a moment, king. Cotton is a major export that clothes the world. And the advent of cotton as a clothing material is, of course, a revolution. And it's a revolution that I'm not going to talk about in the world context, but of course it's a major deal for the relationship between India and England, because India had been the world's chief cotton producer. They're the ones who had the technology. The British go in and they destroy that technology and basically force the continental Indian population to relearn things on their system, and they begin to monopolize it. And of course, you just heard about me talking about India and England, and that's a whole different story. But my point, and a very important one, but my point is that cotton is extraordinarily valuable. And along the sea islands in the American South grow what's called long staple cotton. So that's the expensive cotton. Now that during the American Civil War is going to start being produced in India and Egypt. And it's much softer. It's got much longer fibers. And so they don't prick at you the way cotton itself is a pretty mild, fairly long staple anyway. But if you think about why wool is scratchy, it's because the fibers are short, so they poke out and they hit you. And why fleece is so artificial fleece, not sheep fleece, but artificial fleece is so soft, it's because they can spin artificial fibers very, very long, so there's nothing to poke out and hit you and scratch you. Well, long staple cotton is the 19th century's equivalent of fleece, if you will, and because it's got a long staple, so it makes stuff that's much silkier than normal cotton would be. And you see this now if you order sheets. You will know that Egyptian cotton is more expensive than normal cotton, and that's because it does come from Egypt as well, but it is literally a kind of cotton that is different than normal cotton. Anyway, the American South can grow that long staple cotton, and that means it's going to make bank. But it also means that that money is going to go to the very wealthiest members of the American South. And they quickly, beginning really in the 1830s, but taking off in the 1840s, and I'm not really going to talk here about the growth of American enslavement and what that does to American society as a whole, or what that does to America's enslaved population, which is itself an incredibly important topic. But today I want to focus on governmental systems, because that's obviously what's on the table when a senator can say it's not about democracy. So what that means then is that these large planters begin to develop the idea that what they're doing is good. That when they are enslaving others, they were kind of nervous about that until about 1831. In 1831, there's a convention in Virginia that is actually there to talk about emancipation. And unfortunately, it coincides with the Nat Turner Rebellion, which means Virginians come down really hard on the idea of enslavement, and they actually take away even more rights from enslaved people after 1831. But until 1831, there's some people who are like iffy on this. They're thinking, it doesn't really square with our ideas about morality, our ideas about labor. Maybe this isn't such a great idea. But after 1831, they're all in, except the few who complain and tend to get out of the South. But what they start to do is they start to say, you know what, we're all in, not because we're rotters, because very few people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do something because I'm a jerk. They wake up and they say, we're in because we're good people. And we need to take care of these lesser beings around us. Now, of course, this is complete justification, but you can see it in the early novels, if you will. They're not actually even technically novels yet in the 19th century, coming out of the American South. Books like A Swallow Barn by John Pendleton Kennedy, which you can find on Google Books if you're interested. It's not even, like I say, a novel, but it's discussions with a Southern planter. And it talks a lot about why it's just better for these elite white enslavers to run things, because they're educated and they're Christian and they are leading these lesser people to what they would call civilization. And they're starting to form this idea that they really are better, certainly than their African American. At this point, they're largely not going to be African, although there'll be some. They're largely African American, some Afro-Caribbean. That they're better than those people, that those are not, in a way, almost even people. And this idea, beginning in the 1830s, begins to infiltrate the churches, where the idea is that they're, basically the enslavers are leading these benighted people to Christianity. Many of them are Christian. A lot of them are Muslim. People forget that we do, in fact, have a Muslim history in America, a long one, with our Americans who have African forebears. But there is this idea in literature, in the church, in society, this growing idea that these enslavers are better, certainly, than their enslaved population. But that still doesn't answer the question of democracy. So what happens? What happens is that in the 1840s and the 1850s, as land increasingly gets concentrated at the top of society, and as wealth increasingly gets concentrated at the top of society, because this is a capital-rich economy, in order to successfully grow cotton and rice. Tobacco is sort of falling by the wayside by now, because the land in the tobacco belt has gotten overused and it's largely been destroyed. We're not going to be able to rebuild that until after we get modern fertilizers, beginning in the 1880s and the 1890s. And even still, there are lands in Virginia that are being rehabilitated from the damages of tobacco. But all of those things, cotton and rice, they are industries. They're extractive industries in a sense. They're industries that require a lot of very high capitalization and a lot of workers who don't get paid. I would say very much, but really who don't get paid. But there's lots of money in it if you can make a go of it. Well, most Southern white enslavers, in fact, are not of this class. They might own another human being, but it tends to be one or two people who work alongside them. And increasingly, those people, those ordinary white Southerners, if you will, resent that rising class of very wealthy planters. And they increasingly don't like the legislation that is protecting those very wealthy planters and not them. For their part, they would like to see more development of the country. They would like to see education, because their kids can't afford an education. And as they are starting to talk that way, again, the very wealthy say, no, 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 no. Our Constitution says we can't do any of those things, because if we do any of those things, those people in the North are going to use the power of the federal government to start to interfere in the economy, and they're going to start to interfere in ways that we don't like. They're going to start hemming in the conditions of human enslavement. And what they're worried about at first is not the end of enslavement yet, but Northerners, when they start to talk about changing enslavement patterns in the South, what they are talking about by the 1840s really is not the end of human enslavement at first. They're looking at the excesses of this hyper-capitalist economy in the South, and they're saying, hey, you got to stop selling kids away from their parents. You got to stop sex trafficking girls. You got to stop splitting up marriages. And there's one historian who speculates that if the South had been willing to put those guardrails against their version of capitalism, slavery might have gone on a lot longer. But of course, Southerners looked at that, Southern elites looked at that and said, no, we are not going to bear any kind of limits on what we can do with our property. And as a result, they hammer on the idea that the Constitution can do nothing. The Constitution is it's only what's in it. It's only what is enumerated in it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. So meanwhile, while white Southerners, elite white Southerners are solidifying their power over the economy and over the American South, they're getting really nervous about the protection of slavery. And the reason for that is because people in the North are looking at at democracy, small d democracy, and they're looking at the fact that they really would like the federal government to step in to do more to promote the ability of ordinary men to apply their labor to resources and to rise. They want to have equal access to resources, but there are things that they would like the federal government to do. They would like it to build a road across the Appalachian Mountains so that people can more easily get across them. They would like it to dredge rivers and harbors. Again, something that one guy can't do, that you actually need to put your money together to go ahead and do. But if you did that, it would open up the ability of so many young men to go ahead and rise. And Abraham Lincoln is all about this. You know, remember, he starts that store and it fails. And it fails, he believes, because the river, the town where he starts it is on a river. And that river silts up, so people can't come to it anymore. And he sits there going, if only somebody would dig this out, I wouldn't be bankrupt, but I can't dig it out. So, you know, he looks at that, and he actually has fragments in his papers where he says, let's think about when you need a federal government. You need a federal government to do things that people can't do on their own. And there's actually 3 fragments. I've quoted them in at least one of my books, but you can find them if you want to. Anytime you want to look at anything Lincoln did, go to just Google Bosler, Basler, comma, collected works, and what you get is a definitive collection of Lincoln's works that is extremely well keyworded. So you could put in just the word fragment, and these fragments would come up, or something, or anything else you want to know if Lincoln talked about it. Anytime any of us want to get a Lincoln quotation, that's what we do, because it's by far the fastest way to come up with a Lincoln quotation. I don't even check my own books. I go to Bosler if I want to find a Lincoln quotation. So Northerners are looking at this and they're saying, we'd kind of like the federal government to do something. Now, this struggle goes on, and of course, you know, the crisis of the 1850s comes after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And that's the treaty after the Mexican-American War, in which America gains the territory that previously had been owned by Mexico after the Mexican Revolution in 1821. And that's going to be the last major acquisition of territory in the lower 48, with the exception of the 1853 Gadsden Purchase. I'm not going to talk more about the Gadsden Purchase right now, but if anybody's interested in the Indian Wars, the Gadsden Purchase is central to the Apache Wars. So, but you'll probably never hear me talk about that again unless I actually do a series on Indigenous history. But so with that acquisition of land, the North and the South have a real problem, because after 1820, they had made a deal over the continental U.S. and they had said that after on the line that crosses underneath Missouri, the land above that is going to be free, and the land below that is going to allow enslavers to own human beings. But that Missouri Compromise line does not go all the way to the Pacific. So all this new land is newly acquired land. Who knows what's going to happen? Well, after 1848, with this acquisition, 10 days before that treaty was signed, indigenous workers at Sutter's Mill in California had discovered gold. And of course, the Mexicans did not know that when they signed the treaty, or they never would have, and this continent would have looked a lot different geopolitically, but they didn't know that. So after the signing of the treaty, of course, we get the gold rush in 1849 into California. And it's a gold rush that includes, of course, white Americans, but it also includes the indigenous people who live in California, Chileans who have a history of mining themselves, Mexicans who also have a history of mining, and also, of course, Chinese coming from Asia after the Opium Wars to try and make a fortune in what they called Gold Mountain. These people all rushing into California mean there has to be a very quick settlement of what's going to happen in that new territory. That was Mexican territory, now it's American territory, and it is nuts out there because there is no legal system. So quickly, the North and the South are forced to come to some kind of agreement, if you will, about what the government is going to look like and what the government is going to do. And while I'm not going to give you a whole rundown through the 1850s, what happens is that those elite slave owners, those very wealthy men, quickly, that by 1850, they dominate the Democratic Party, which is the party to which they belong, because the Democratic Party focuses on local government, on the idea that that people can make their decisions locally, and what they say is, therefore, we are going to have slavery because we locally want it. So they gravitate toward the Democratic Party, and they come to control the Democratic Party. In contrast to them, first, the Whig Party says that it's going to go ahead and develop the idea of a government that does, in fact, promote internal improvements. But the Whigs fall apart by the 1848, 1850, long story there. And they're going to be replaced in just a minute by a new political party called the Republican Party. So the Democrats in the 1850s take a look at this new land and they say, we want to spread there. We want to spread human enslavement there because we have the right to. We're Americans and we have this phenomenal economy. Look how rich we are. We belong out here. And they manage to stake this claim that they are going to be able to move into the West, to the point that Northerners sort of compromise in 1850 and say, okay, well, we'll divide that region up into two big territories and people there can choose what they want. Don't bother to remember that because that's going to go by the wayside. But what happens is in 1854, in fact, they get really grabby. And they say, no, we actually want not to worry so much right now about the far West. We've got something there, but we actually want the land that we gave up in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. And we would like to go ahead and get rid of that Missouri Compromise line and spread enslavement into the American West, into what is now a number of states above Missouri. And Northerners look at that and they say, wait a minute, we had a deal here. And now you're changing the rules. You got everything you cut out of it, and now we're changing the rules. But the Democrats force that through. They force through the idea that enslavement can go into those lands that had been protected under the Missouri Compromise. And that's in 1854. And in response to that, you get the rise of what is called the anti-Nebraska Party. The people who are not against Nebraska, they're against what they call the slave power. The idea of these elite Southerners taking over American society. And why they care about that is this. What they believe is that if these very wealthy guys move into this new land, and by the way, of course, this land is owned by the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Crow and the Kiowa to some degree. Never mind. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. And I'm not going to talk about that now because that's, again, a very important story, but not today's story. What they say is that if these guys are unable to spread enslavement, what they're going to do is they're going to take over the American West, and they're going to dominate not only the Senate, but they're going to go ahead and be able to get control of the House of Representatives. And as soon as they get control of the House of Representatives, they are going to make slavery national. And as they are monopolizing resources everywhere, because they're the ones with all the money, they're going to make it so ordinary men can't rise. They're going to cut ordinary men out of the dream of American democracy. They're going to make, while the Southerners are saying, we're allowed to spread our system out there, Northerners are saying, but then you're going to shut little guys like us out of the ability to join an economy and to rise. And so they start to push back. And again, it's important to remember they're really not pushing back against human enslavement in the American South. Most of them are as racist as the Southerners. What they are pushing back against is the domination of the American government by a small group of oligarchs, a group they call the slave power. Now, this is in 54. By 56, there is enough concern about the rise of this slave power that there are three people running in that election of 1856. There's a Democrat, James Buchanan. There's a Republican, John C. Fremont. And there is a member of the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, and that's Millard Fillmore, who's a previous president. In that 1856 election, James Buchanan had been out of the country. He had been the minister to St. James, the court of St. James, and so he had not been part of the fights in the 1850s. So people were able to vote with him with the idea that he might not be like the other Southern leaders. He's actually from Pennsylvania himself. He's a Northerner, so they think they've got some hope there. But it's interesting. I mean, it's important that both the Republican who stood against the slave power and the American Know Nothing Party, Millard Fillmore, also stood against the slave power, and they got far more votes together than Buchanan did. But of course, they canceled each other out, and Buchanan wins in 56. And what he does is he says at his inauguration, he says, I know you guys are all upset about slavery, but, you know, there's a solution at hand, not to worry, because the Supreme Court is about to decide this issue once and for all. And he makes that statement in March of 57, and I believe it's within a week, the Supreme Court hands down the Dred Scott decision. And that Dred Scott decision, among other things, says that Congress has no right to legislate in the territories. And what that means is that the territories, by definition, are all going to become dominated by these large enslavers, because once you have moved a single enslaved person into a territory under the Constitution, he or she is property, and the right to property must be protected. Really important to remember that when we are talking about the fight over slavery, we are in fact talking about the fight over democracy. All right, so how does this play out? It's a huge fight. I mean, Northerners are like, forget this, and they start to try and guarantee that territories in that Western land will in fact not be dominated by enslavers, but will be dominated by people who believe in what's called free labor. Well, in 1858, and this goes back to Lee, in 1858, a South Carolina senator named James Henry Hammond stands up in Congress, in the Senate, and he gives a speech, and he says, you people in the North are making a mistake when you talk about society. The way society works is to have a small group of elites, like me. He doesn't actually say that, but he means it, running society. Because the vast majority of human beings are mudsills, he calls them. They're stupid, they're lazy, they take direction well, they're loyal, they tend to be happy people, and they need people like us to make their work efficient. So the way the world really works is this. Those guys work really hard, and guys and women work very hard, and they produce capital. They produce goods that we sell, and we accumulate capital. And that money all comes up to us at the top. And we, because we're well educated and smart and well connected, we use that efficiently so that we develop the economy, and we buy art, and we get educations. And thanks to us, we pull society forward. And it's good for them because they get elevated and educated. And it's good for society because we move things forward. And that's the problem that you people in the North have made. You've made the mistake of taking that whole Declaration of Independence thing to heart. The idea that all men are created equal. Of course they're not created equal. That's ridiculous. That was just highfalutin language. People are not created equal. And really, people like us should dominate. But he says, you in the North are making a big mistake, because you let your mudsills, and by the way, a mudsill is the sills driven into the dirt to support an edifice. You let your mudsills vote. And the problem is, they're going to vote to get more of the stuff they're producing. And once they've done that, that money's not going to accumulate at the top any longer, and society's going to fall apart. It's going to stagnate, fall apart. Nothing's going to move forward any longer. So he gives this speech, and he says, it doesn't really matter what people want. We don't care that you Northerners want a road across the Appalachians or want dredged rivers and harbors. What matters is that the Constitution says, even if every single member of the country wants it, you can't have it, because the Constitution is 100% limited. We have to go by what the founders wanted. That's originalism, right? So this is another topic that's come up. So Abraham Lincoln responds to this the following year, in which he says, that's not how society works. Society works best when you put resources at the bottom among ordinary people, because they're the ones who innovate and are hungry, and they come up with new ideas, and they're going to produce more than they can consume. And that capital, he literally calls capital pre-exerted labor, is going to rise to the next level. And they, in turn, are going to support a very small group of industrialists and financiers who are going to hire people at the bottom. That's how you drive society forward. All right, so as you know, Lincoln wins, the South takes its marbles and goes home. I'm not going to go into that. I'm trying to chase through this argument about democracy. So, what happens from this? What happens is during the American Civil War, the Republican Party under Lincoln goes ahead and develops our first activist economy. It does exactly what Lincoln said it should do. It starts to put resources at the bottom: education, homesteads, railroads, new money based on the people, the agricultural department. It tries to develop people's ability to have access to resources and to education so they can, in fact, develop the country. This is extremely popular. But also, in order to fight the war, they impose our first national income taxes, national taxes in general, which are essentially in sales taxes. That's not quite what they are, but essentially for our purposes, and our first income taxes. And then in 1865, they abolish slavery except as punishment after conviction for a crime. And by 1870, under the Republican Party, they insist that African American men get the right to vote. On the heels of that, those Southern Democrats who stood dead against the idea of Black equality in American society dropped their objections to Black participation in America based on race, because under President Ulysses S. Grant, he has broken the KKK and he's created the Department of Justice to make sure those guys can't make their racial arguments stick. And they switched to a new kind of argument. And what they say is this. They say, we don't care that these people are Black. That's fine with us, which is, I won't say it, BS. We don't care about that at all. Of course they do. But they say, we don't care about that at all. What we care about is these are poor people who are using the vote to elect people who are promising them things like roads and schools and hospitals. And that is costing tax dollars. And those tax dollars are paid for by people who own property. And who would that be? That's us, the white people. So we don't care about the fact they're Black. We care about the fact that they are voting, and they are voting for policies that require taxes. And those tax dollars are creating a redistribution of wealth from us to them, hardworking white people to African Americans. It is, one might say, socialism, or after 1871, they call it communism. It has nothing to do with world communism, which is not even a twinkle in Karl Marx's eye yet, which is going to really come to the fore in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. But so let me get you up to there, but let me really solidify the idea that socialism in America is not about the concept of 20th century socialism or communism at all. I can tell you where the word comes from, but it doesn't really matter. What it means is that people who don't want African American participation in society say that letting poor people vote is going to redistribute wealth, and that is socialism. That's where it comes from, folks. That's it. 1871 through 1874. All right, so what is Mike Lee talking about? Where do we get to where we are now? That idea that a few people are better than others, that James Henry Hammond articulated, is going to come up again. And it's going to come up again in the late 19th century, because after the industrial issues across the world in the late 19th century, a lot of people are grappling with the structure of society. Like why, this obviously rampant capitalism is causing all kinds of problems. So what's going to replace it? And people turn to the historical theory of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which is a historical theory about how societies change. And they decide that, in fact, they do embrace the idea that capitalism, hypercapitalism, is going to come to a place where it collapses, and the people who are destroyed by it turn against their rulers and their industrial leaders, and they seize the means of production, and they create a much fairer society. That stage of the historical theory is called socialism, although Engels and Marx tended to use socialism and communism interchangeably. That doesn't really matter. Again, for me today, maybe matter to them, but it's different theory. It's a different theoretical point that I'm trying to make here. But so a lot of people at the turn of the last century want socialism. They want to change this crazy industrial capitalism that has children selling their bodies and people losing their arms and legs in factories and pollution all over the cities. They want to change that. But they can't seem to get people to sign on. And it's a real issue of frustration. Why don't people want to change the system? Look at it. There's so many of us who don't want it. There's so few of them who do want it. Why isn't it changing? And they start to theorize about this. And this is one of the pieces of historical theory I love, because it's a real problem, right? Why do people vote for things they don't like? So people who are beginning to talk about Marxist theory, the idea of people rising, say, wait a minute, why aren't the people rising? And so what they do is they come up with this idea. And this idea really is associated largely with Lenin, who is a political thinker, Vladimir Lenin, who is a Russian political thinker, in addition to everything else he does. But he says, you know what the problem is? The problem is that people can't see outside the lives that they lead. They're bound by it. So they can't envision a different world than they live in. So they're really obliged to leaders, a few leaders, maybe 10% of the population, who are smart enough to be outside and look back and tell them what is happening. And it's this group of people, this small group of people, who are able to see clearly and to lead people out of that darkness in which they live. You might recognize this, those of you who study American political theory, because this is the position from which W.B. Du Bois was coming when he talks about the talented 10th. When he talks in that about Booker T. Washington, he is literally saying Booker T. Washington can't see out of the world in which he lives. He's a great man, but it's going to take people like me who didn't grow up enslaved to be able to look back and show him what the system really looks like. So there's this idea among socialist thinkers coming into the 20th century that it takes a very small group of people to go ahead and lead the rest of the people to the new government. But here's the problem. It's not working. Like, people are not coming along. And so in the 1920s, after World War I, Benito Mussolini is a socialist in Italy. Has been very frustrated with the fact he can't get people on board socialism. And he looks at how incredibly efficient Italy was during socialism, during World War I, and he says, hey, we were all moving in the right direction then. We were all moving really, really well. Italy did a great job in this war. The industry was all working in the same direction. The people were all united. They managed to put together this united front. That there's a lesson here to be learned. And what he comes up with in the 1920s is that he argues that the problem with socialism was that people are like trying to herd ducks. You can't really do it. So what people really need is they need that 10% to organize them. They need to simply be told what to do rather than trying to get people to join in on their own. That small group of people really knows better than that larger group of people. Now, I did that for a reason. I put it that way for a reason. He's coming from an extremely different position than James Henry Hammond, but it's the same conclusion. The idea that what you really need is this small group of people to lead everybody else. And in order to do that, you've got to bring them together by making them militaristic, making them hate someone, by making sure that the government and business work absolutely hand in hand, ultimately by having a very small group of leaders overseen by one person. Because if people are not all the same, if some people are better than others, of course there's going to be one person who's better than another. And what he does is he comes up with this new political theory in the 1920s, and that theory is called fascism, from fasces, the Latin concept of being strong together as one. As I say, it's a very different place that James Henry Hammond started from, but the conclusion that some people are better than others is exactly the same. So let me go forward now. Where does that leave us with the present when you have somebody like Mike Lee literally saying democracy isn't the objective, liberty, peace, and prosperity are the objectives? I'm sorry, I just closed the tabs. I don't want to get that exactly right. Democracy isn't the objective, liberty, peace, and prosperity are. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that. Well, what is he saying? Since the 1950s, a faction of the Republican Party that now dominates that party has fought desperately against the idea of the expansion of the right to vote to minorities and to women. And they have done so with the argument that was pioneered after Reconstruction in the 1870s, based on James Henry Hammond's idea that if you let ordinary people vote, they're going to vote to redistribute wealth. They're going to vote to get some of what they produce. The money's not all going to flow up. The money's actually going to be more evenly distributed. And when they do that, that, according to this language after 1950, was a form of communism or socialism, because people really were going to want some of what they produced. Now, since 1981, Ronald Reagan's first tax cut of 1981, money, as you ought to know if you don't, has flowed upward in American society. We've had a dramatic redistribution of wealth since 1981, and it is all upward. The same way it was in the 1850s, the same way it was in the 1890s, and the same way it was in the 1920s. And what that has meant for the movement conservatives, who did not want that to happen, is that they have increasingly argued that to let ordinary Americans vote, to let them have a say in their society, is not a form of democracy, or it's certainly not a form of American government that they want to embrace. This is why you keep hearing people say, we're not supposed to be a democracy, we're supposed to be a republic. What they are saying is, if you let people at the bottom vote, they're going to vote for fairer access to what they are producing. And that is, in their minds, destructive, because it means that money's not going to flow upward. That money is not going to be concentrated in a way that the very elite groups can move society forward the same way James Henry Hammond said they should, and the same way theorists like Benito Mussolini said they should. That argument that somehow letting people vote harks right back to what James Henry Hammond said, that will, in fact, end American greatness, because it means that people are going to ask for more of what they produce, and they should not be able to do that. That is a form, as I say, of communism or socialism. But by 1920, when Benito Mussolini is talking about it, it is the basis of fascism. That view of the world that a few people, usually led by one person, should determine the course of a country, because that's the most efficient way to do it, is the rise of fascism. And it's the same theory about how society works. Now, that's what we stood against. Under FDR in World War II, FDR again and again hammered home the value of democracy. And he said, we believe, like Abraham Lincoln did, that this government belongs to the people. The government belongs to the ordinary people who are trying to apply their labor to resources, to get an education, to innovate, to take care of their families. And yeah, it's messy. We disagree a lot. We don't do things in a very good way. It's hard to turn the ship of state around. But he pointed repeatedly to the fact that Mussolini could not feed the Italian people. It was the American troops who came in and were able to put food on tables. And it's the American troops who win battles and who end up putting down Mussolini's troops. One of the men I grew up with here was in the push on up the boot of Italy. And he hammered again and again on the idea that America stands for democracy. And that's the idea that Abraham Lincoln embraced, the idea that society really moves forward best, not when you focus on a small group of elites, but rather when you focus on ordinary people. And not in Lincoln's terms, not necessarily for moral reasons, certainly not for FDR for moral reasons, although many of us believe that's morally right, but for totally self-interested reasons, because you want your society to be healthy. You want it to have new ideas. You want it to innovate. You want people to work hard. And the way you do that is you put the focus on those people who are going to do those things, the ordinary people. The people who come up with new ideas, the people who try new things and fail a lot of the time, but they have new ideas because they don't have a stake in a system that has made them rich. They're trying always to try new things and to make America or any country cohesive and to move forward along with it. And that idea that The society works best when you kind of multitask things, when you have new ideas, when you're willing to say, I don't know everything. And I'm willing to hear new ideas. I'm willing to listen and to come up with new ways of doing things. That's really slow and it's really messy. And sometimes people are elected that you don't like. And sometimes you think people have ridiculously stupid ideas. But sometimes you stand back and go, man, I never thought of that. And certainly you have seen that in the commentary on my letters and on these videos. All the time I'm saying, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. Well, that's how, to my mind, you move a society forward. You crowdsource things, in a sense. They certainly weren't using that term. But I am absolutely a firm adherent to the democracy that has been embraced and articulated so well, of course, by Lincoln and by FDR, and later on by people like Eisenhower, and certainly now by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, who are deliberately reaching back to that older tradition. But I think it's really worth emphasizing that when a senator says, a sitting senator says, as Mike Lee did this morning, says that it's not about democracy, that democracy, rank democracy, can stop us from moving forward. He is not only echoing the words of James Henry Hammond and the elite slave holders of the American South in the 1850s, as they were trying to take over American society and make it so ordinary Americans couldn't rise. He is also echoing the language of fascism, the 20th century language of fascism. And I think it's time we put that on the table and recognize that what we are arguing for today, what I am arguing for today, is not for Democrats or Republicans. As you've probably heard me say a lot, I really believe we need two competitive, healthy parties in order to achieve and preserve democracy, because they articulate opposition, legitimate opposition, and they provide oversight of each other. What we are really arguing about today is the survival of American democracy, of that idea, as Lincoln put it, that this country should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I, for one, am 100% in this fight. And I'm just thrilled to have you guys along with me. So thank you for letting me take the day and do whatever the hell I wanted. And I hope that helped you understand a little bit about American socialism and what that meant, and how that's different than the world socialist movement, and how democracy stacks up against the rise of fascism and where we are today. And I suspect I'll see you tonight. I did not want to write tonight. I wanted to take the night off. But of course, the attack on Governor Whitmer has pretty much meant that I'm going to be writing tonight as usual. Thanks a lot for being here. And I will come up with a better plan for next week. I'll see you later.